Hello, AP Environmental Science students. This section of notes will be on ecological succession. So our essential knowledge are the things that we'll be looking at today. There are two main types of ecological succession, primary and secondary succession. Pioneer members of an early succession species commonly move into unoccupied habitats and adapt to its particular conditions, which may result in the origin of a new species. Succession is in a distributed ecosystem will affect the total biomass, species richness, and net productivity over time. As well as a keystone species in an ecosystem is a species whose activities have a particular significant role in determining community structure. And an indicator species is a plant or animal that, by its presence, abundance, scarcity, or chemical composition, demonstrates some distinctive aspect of the character or quality of an ecosystem is present. So ecological succession. So when we have a community, the dominant species going through their regular life cycle, will cause changes to the environment. So just by being around, whatever that main dominant species is going to kind of shape its environment and the ecosystem around it. And as those changes add up, it's gradually going to push that dominant species out of their range of tolerance. So remember, that range of tolerance could be things like what temperatures they like. If we're talking about something like fish and water, the pH, the amount of dissolved oxygen, things like that. But because of those changes to their environment over time, they're going to kind of push out and change their range of tolerance. And eventually, when that happens, there will be a new dominant species that will take over. So this is kind of an overview of what this succession looks like. We'll talk about it, but we can start with something that's just exposed rocks and move our way into having this nice forest. It's going to take time and some different things to make that happen. So we'll talk about those. So primary versus secondary succession. So primary succession is going to be this gradual change over time in a community that starts with pretty much a barren landscape. So nothing, no soil. If you go back to that picture, it's just the rocks. So not a whole lot of life to be found. It's primary succession. So primary succession is starting from pretty much the bottom, from nothing. It's the first thing. Secondary succession is going to be some kind of gradual change to the community, usually after that ecosystem has been disrupted. And we'll talk about what some of these disruptions could be. But one example is kind of like what's going on out west with the forest fires. Technically, that ecosystem, that community will undergo a second succession. So primary succession, this occurs when we have some kind of new land that is exposed or created. So with land being created, we're talking about things like lava flows. So you have lava, you have this new set of land, it's just rock. Something is going to occupy that eventually over time. When glaciers retreat, so this is an example here where this is all glacier, so not a whole lot of it being used, and slowly it's retreated. But that area can be used for that primary succession or island emergence. So kind of like what's happening with Hawaii right now, over that hot spot where there's lava coming up in the ocean and slowly building a new island. So the big island of Hawaii that we know will soon not be the big island because it's forming right now, and it will slowly start moving. But the big thing with primary succession is that soil formation must occur first. So remember, with primary succession, we're talking about a barren landscape, rock, and the formation of soil has to occur in order for things to continue forward. And then with secondary succession, these exist when there's some kind of disruption to the land. So like I said, this could be things like fires, landslides, hurricanes, flooding events, anything that is going to more or less drastically change what that community looks like. So there has to be some kind of, you can think of it as almost like a natural disaster going through to get our secondary succession. With our primary succession, we also have pioneer species. And those pioneer species are the things that are able to survive without soil. So they don't need that soil there. They can just survive with the rocks. And its life, so the life of our pioneer species and death, is going to be what produces that soil. So them going through that cycle is going to produce a soil to allow for that community to rise. And in secondary succession, our pioneer species must be able to adapt or be adapted to those conditions left behind that by that disturbance. So if something changed with like a fire going through, if they can't live in a landscape that maybe has, say that we have a species that's used to eating a certain type of plant, but in the fire it all gets burned up, and another one ends up surviving. Well, if they can't shift their diet to eating that other type of plant, well, they're not going to be able to survive. The ones that have, though, are going to be our pioneer species, in secondary succession. And then we have climax community. Oh, one quick thing. So pioneer species for our primary succession are going to be things like lichen, moss, stuff like that, that can survive on those rocks, don't need to eat food. So I mean, they're photosynthetic, so they're going to get their food through that. But in the process of actually like clinging onto a rock, so when you see lichen or moss on a rock, it is breaking down the minerals in that rock slowly over time to create some new soil. And last but not least, we have climax community. So eventually, after the succession has taken root, and it will take a lot of time, it's going to reach a point where it's relatively stable, where things aren't changing too much. And if there's no other disruption, some kind of dominant species will take over and be the dominant species in that community. And the stable group is referred to as our climax community. So we finally reached that end. So just to go back, if we look at here, so this right here is what we get this is what we start with primary succession. So just rocks, then things like lichen and mosses over could be tens of hundreds of years are going to work on these rocks, break them down, live, die, create more soil. And then we're going to get things like annual weeds, some smaller brush type plants, and just continue on with getting gradually more and more complex and more large species of plants. But you also have to think that dirt has to be created, that soil has to be created in order to allow for these things to thrive. Now, if we had a fire come through and burn down all these trees, and maybe some of these brush, maybe some of that survives, then our secondary succession would start. We're going to work our way back to this, but maybe in that secondary succession, instead of like birches and maple forests being the focus, maybe we get more of like a boreal forest, or maybe we get more oaks. It depends on the conditions we're at and what's going on with it. But that'll do it for succession. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.